There's a moment every person faces, a moment where staying quiet is the safe choice, the smart choice, the choice that keeps the money flowing and the phone ringing. Most people take that exit. They lower their heads, say nothing, and move on with their lives. But 9 people in Hollywood looked at that exit and walked right past it. Not because they were naive, not because they didn't understand what was waiting on the other side. They walked past it because something inside them refused to let comfort win over conscience. These weren't activists by profession. They were movie stars, the biggest names in the business, the ones whose faces sold tickets and whose signatures on a contract could greenlight a $100 million production. And they threw all of it into the fire, willingly, knowingly, because the world they were living in was broken in ways that silence could no longer excuse. Hollywood's golden era wasn't golden for everyone. Behind the glamour and the premieres and the red carpets, there was a machine that ran on discrimination. Black actors were paid less, credited less, and treated as though their talent was something to be tolerated rather than celebrated. Segregation wasn't just a Southern problem. It lived inside the industry itself, in the way deals were made and the way credit was given, in the way human beings were valued based on the color of their skin. And most people in power looked the other way. But these 9 didn't. They marched. They walked off sets. They defied studio executives who threatened to destroy them. They flew across oceans and crossed enemy lines, not in wartime, but in a country that was at war with itself. The FBI watched them. Death threats arrived at their homes, roles disappeared overnight, and still not one of them backed down. What Johnny Carson revealed across 3 decades of interviews was something far more rare than talent or beauty or fame. He revealed what it actually costs to stand for something when everything you've built is on the line. So let's go back to the era when saying no to racism wasn't a social media moment, but a career-ending gamble, and meet the 9 stars who took that gamble and never once looked back. Starting with number 9, Tony Curtis. Curtis grew up in New York, the son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants, and clawed his way out of poverty into becoming one of Hollywood's most magnetic leading men. His dark eyes and effortless charm carried him through classics like Some Like It Hot. But it was a lesser-known moment in 1958 that truly defined who he was. Stanley Kramer was preparing The Defiant Ones, a film about a white prisoner and a black prisoner chained together and forced to confront their mutual hatred. Sidney Poitier had the role opposite Curtis, and the two were set to deliver what would become one of cinema's most powerful performances. But when the billing came down, the studio wanted Curtis's name front and center, large and prominent, with Poitier's name tucked underneath in smaller type. This was standard practice. It was how the industry worked. Black actors, no matter how talented, no matter how central to a film, were treated as secondary. Curtis looked at that arrangement and said no. He went to the executives and told them plainly that he and Poitier were co-stars, equal in every sense, and their names would reflect that. It sounds simple when you say it out loud, but in 1958 it was revolutionary. Equal billing for a black actor alongside a white star was almost unheard of. The studio pushed back, but Curtis held firm, and when the film released, both men received top billing side by side. Both earned Oscar nominations. The film tackled racism head-on during one of America's most divided periods, and Curtis's insistence on treating his co-star with dignity helped shift what audiences and studios expected. He was labeled difficult by the industry, and the stand cost him leverage in future negotiations. But he never regretted it. Curtis passed away in 2010 at 85. And his quiet act of equality helped normalize something that should never have needed normalizing in the first place. Number 8, James Garner. Garner was the kind of man who didn't waste words explaining himself. He was from Oklahoma, built like someone who'd worked hard his entire life, and when he called himself a bleeding heart liberal, he meant every syllable. On August 28, 1963, 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, and Garner was among them. He hadn't come as a spectator. He'd helped organize Hollywood's participation alongside Harry Belafonte, working behind the scenes to get as many stars as possible onto those streets. The night before the march, The FBI called every celebrity individually. The message was the same each time: stay away. We can't guarantee your safety. It was intimidation dressed up as concern. And Garner saw it for exactly what it was. He flew to Washington anyway, and when he arrived, something happened that would become one of the most iconic images of the entire civil rights movement. A photographer captured Garner walking hand in hand with black actress Diahann Carroll. In 1963 America, that image was scandalous to many. A white man and a black woman, fingers interlaced, walking together in public as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Because to Garner it was. He didn't pose for the photo, he didn't make a spectacle of it. He simply held her hand because they were walking together, and that's what people do. Southern theaters pulled his films afterward, and the financial hit was real. But Garner continued pushing for equality through his work on the Screen Actors Guild Board, using his position to advocate for fairer labor practices. He died in 2014 at 86, and that photograph endures as proof that sometimes the most powerful statements don't require a single word. Number 7. Kirk Douglas. Douglas lived to 103, long enough to watch the world change in ways he'd spent his life demanding. The man behind Spartacus was Hollywood's original rebel, and in 1960 he made a decision that cracked open one of the darkest chapters in the industry's history. The blacklist had been destroying careers for years. Writers, directors, actors, anyone suspected of communist sympathies, or, more often, anyone who simply dared to challenge the status quo, was quietly erased from Hollywood. Dalton Trumbo, one of the most talented screenwriters alive, had been blacklisted and was writing under assumed names just to keep working. When Douglas hired Trumbo to write Spartacus and then publicly credited him by name, it was the first time a major star had openly defied the blacklist. The industry shook, but Douglas wasn't finished. He used his producing power to demand something that should have been a given: integrated crews on every single one of his productions. When a black crew member was denied access to facilities on one of his sets, Douglas didn't send a memo or file a complaint. He walked off. He refused to come back until everyone on that set was treated equally, until the bathrooms and dining areas were open to all, regardless of race. This was during an era when segregation on set was considered normal, even expected. Studios threatened to blacklist Douglas the same way they destroyed the Hollywood 10. He didn't flinch. He marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963, poured money into the NAACP, and kept pushing. His Jewish heritage gave him a personal understanding of what it meant to be targeted for who you are, and he carried that understanding with him into every fight. The cost was staggering. He lost roles worth millions because studios decided he was too much trouble. But Douglas understood something most people in his position never learned. There is no amount of money that makes silence acceptable when you have the power to speak. He passed away in 2020, and his sons Michael and Joel carried his legacy forward, proving that the deepest convictions can travel through generations. Number 6. Elizabeth Taylor. Taylor's violet eyes and extraordinary beauty made her one of the most photographed women on the planet. But the fire inside her started burning long before she became a legend. As a child star at MGM in the 1940s, Taylor watched black co-stars being treated as though they were lesser human beings. She was 13 years old when she walked up to studio executives and demanded that her black co-star be given the same respect and dignity she received. 13. The executives tried to shut her down. She refused to be shut down. That stubbornness never left her. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, Taylor refused to attend segregated premieres, even for her own films. When a Southern premiere turned away black fans, she walked out on the spot, telling organizers that if not everyone could walk through that door, then neither could she. She marched in Washington in 1963. She canceled appearances at venues that practiced any form of discrimination, absorbing the financial losses without hesitation. Studios called her controversial and withheld roles. It didn't matter. Taylor's activism extended far beyond race. In the 1980s, when the AIDS crisis was devastating communities and most celebrities treated it like something shameful, Taylor threw herself into the fight with a ferocity that stunned everyone. She climbed into bed with her dying friend Rock Hudson, holding him, touching him, showing the world that these were human beings who deserved love and dignity, not fear and abandonment. She received death threats for that act of compassion. She didn't care. Taylor died in 2011 at 79, and what she left behind was more than a filmography. She proved that glamour and conviction could exist in the same person, that being beautiful and being brave were not mutually exclusive, and that sometimes the most radical act a woman could take was simply refusing to stay quiet. Number 5, Humphrey Bogart. Bogart was the tough guy, the fedora, the cigarette, the sardonic drawl that made audiences believe he'd seen everything and feared nothing. But the real test of toughness came not on a screen, but in September 1947, when Bogart co-founded the Committee for the First Amendment and led a group of Hollywood's biggest stars straight into a fight with the United States government. The House Un-American Activities Committee had begun investigating Hollywood, and while the official target was supposed to be communist influence, everyone understood what was really happening. Anyone who spoke up for civil rights, anyone who questioned authority, anyone who dared to suggest that America wasn't living up to its own ideals was being put under a microscope. Bogart looked at that and said no. He and Lauren Bacall joined Danny Kaye, Judy Garland, and more than 20 other stars, chartered a plane to Washington, and showed up at the hearings in person. They sat in the gallery. They smoked. They made it impossible to pretend they weren't there. Bogart became the group's spokesperson, telling reporters plainly that fellow Americans were being stripped of their constitutional rights, and that was reason enough to show up. The trip turned into a disaster. Jack Warner, Bogart's own studio boss, testified against his colleagues. The pressure became suffocating. Studios threatened careers. The government opened investigation. Bogart eventually wrote an article distancing himself from the trip. But even in that piece, the truth bled through. He wrote that he believed Americans were being deprived of their rights, and that alone had been enough to put him on that plane. Years later, when he spoke publicly about the experience, he made clear that defending someone else's rights was never about politics. It was about what it meant to be an American. Bogart died in 1957 at just 57, taken by cancer. But what he started, the idea that Hollywood stars could stand up to government overreach, outlived him by decades and made the activism of the 1960s possible. Number 4. Gregory Peck. Peck's portrayal of Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird made him America's moral conscience on screen. But the man behind that role had been living those values long before Harper Lee put them into words. In 1948, Peck starred in Gentleman's Agreement, one of Hollywood's first serious films about anti-Semitism. His own agent warned him that taking on a role that challenged bigotry could end his career. Peck took it anyway and earned an Oscar nomination. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, he refused to attend segregated premieres of his own films. When a hotel gave him a room but turned away a black member of his cast, Peck walked out and found somewhere else to stay. He marched in Washington in 1963, and when Universal wanted to make To Kill a Mockingbird in 1962, they also wanted to soften the film's anti-racism message to keep it from causing trouble. Peck said no. He fought to preserve Harper Lee's vision exactly as she'd written it, even taking a percentage of profits instead of a guaranteed salary, because he refused to let the studio water down the story. The film that came out of that fight became one of the most important American movies ever made, and Peck won the Oscar for it. But the cost was real. Southern theaters boycotted the film. Studios considered him too controversial and withheld roles. He served as president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences from 1967 to 1970 and used that position to push for greater diversity, retiring inactive members to make room for younger voices and people of color. He donated to civil rights legal defense funds. He testified before Congress on behalf of Soviet Jews seeking the right to immigrate. When Carson asked him years later about risking so much, Peck's answer was quiet and simple. Some things mattered more than safety. He died in 2003 at 87. Atticus Finch remains a moral touchstone precisely because the man who played him earned that role not just with talent, but with his life. Number 3, Burt Lancaster. Lancaster was afraid of flying. Genuinely, deeply, physically afraid. The man who performed his own stunts on screen, who projected fearlessness in every role he played, would break into cold sweats at the mere thought of boarding an airplane. So when he was filming in France in August 1963, and heard about the march on Washington, he had every reason not to go. He was thousands of miles away. He was in the middle of a production, and he would have to get on a plane twice. Lancaster said no to his fear. He got leave from the chute, boarded the plane with shaking hands, flew across the Atlantic, marched with Martin Luther King Jr. at the Lincoln Memorial, and then turned around and flew back to France the very next day. He was one of the few white actors actually given the honor of speaking at the memorial that day, addressing a crowd of hundreds of thousands about why equality was not optional. But Lancaster's activism went back much further. The FBI had been watching him since 1947, when he signed a statement demanding that Congress abolish the House Un-American Activities Committee. He stood alongside Bogart in the Committee for the First Amendment. By 1963, the FBI maintained extensive files on him, tracking his attendance at integration meetings, noting his appearances at politically charged events. When Nixon compiled his enemies list in 1973, Lancaster's name was on it. During the Vietnam War, Lancaster helped defend Billy Dean Smith, a black soldier accused of a serious crime. He contributed thousands of dollars to hire ballistics experts, and Smith was ultimately acquitted. Lancaster and his wife hosted fundraisers for Martin Luther King Jr. at their home, and it was at one of those gatherings that King spoke to Hollywood's elite and inspired so many of them to join the march. Lancaster served as chairman of the ACLU Foundation of Southern California, and in 1988, when George H.W. Bush attacked Michael Dukakis for being an ACLU member, Lancaster appeared on television proudly holding up his own card. He died in 1994 at 80, and the lesson his life taught remains one of the most important truths about courage anyone has ever demonstrated. It has nothing to do with the absence of fear. It's about refusing to let fear decide for you. Number 2, Paul Newman. Newman's blue eyes became legendary, but it was his name on Nixon's enemies list in 1973 that told the real story of who he was. Newman didn't just support the civil rights movement from a safe distance. He went into the Deep South during the early 1960s when going there as a white man, standing beside black protesters meant facing police dogs, fire hoses, and the very real possibility of arrest or worse. Birmingham, Selma, Washington. He showed up at all of them. In 1963, he marched in Birmingham and watched the brutal police crackdown firsthand. He kept going back, trip after trip, because staying silent, as he later told Carson, was simply not something he was willing to do when people were being denied their basic rights. In 1964, Newman testified before Congress in support of the Civil Rights Act, and his testimony was not the polished, rehearsed kind. It was personal, it was direct. It carried weight. The FBI opened files on him. Southern theaters boycotted his films. Death threats arrived at his home, targeting not just him, but his family. Newman refused to back down from any of it. He wouldn't attend segregated premieres of his own movies. And when he discovered that black audience members were being turned away from a screening, he didn't negotiate. He walked out and told the theater manager that either everyone was welcome or he wasn't coming in. It wasn't complicated, he said. Either everyone gets in or I don't. Newman demanded integrated crews on all his productions before the practice became standard. His 1967 film, Cool Hand Luke, carried the weight of a man who understood what it meant to challenge unjust authority, not just as an actor, but as a human being. His wife, Joanne Woodward, shared every conviction he held, and together they created scholarship funds for minority students at multiple universities. Newman founded Newman's Own, and from the beginning the company directed profits towards social justice causes. Even decades after the marches, when most celebrities had moved on to other headlines, Newman kept working. He died in 2008 at 83, and Newman's Own continues funding that work today. What Newman proved was that sustained commitment, year after year, decade after decade, mattered infinitely more than a single dramatic gesture. When you have the world's attention, you have a responsibility. Newman never forgot that. Number 1, Marlon Brando. On March 27, 1973, at the 45th Academy Awards, Marlon Brando won Best Actor for The Godfather. It should have been one of the great nights of his career. Instead, he wasn't there. A young woman named Sakine Littlefeather, an Apache actress and Native American rights activist, walked onto that stage in traditional dress and explained to the stunned audience that Brando had sent her to refuse the award on his behalf. He was protesting Hollywood's treatment of Native Americans and the ongoing crisis at Wounded Knee. The audience divided instantly. Some booed, some applauded. John Wayne, backstage, reportedly had to be physically restrained by security from storming the stage. The media called Brando disrespectful, ungrateful, out of touch. But anyone who had been paying attention knew this was not a surprise. Brando had been saying no to racism for decades. In the early 1960s, he poured thousands of dollars into the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. After Medgar Evers was assassinated, Brando created a scholarship fund for the civil rights leaders' children. He marched in Washington in 1963. With Martin Luther King Jr., he participated in the Freedom Rides through the segregated South, putting his body on the line in places where doing so could have meant jail or worse. In 1964, he was arrested at a Native American fishing protest in Puget Sound, Washington, standing against the government's violation of treaty-guaranteed rights. But April 4, 1968 was the moment that laid bare just how deep Brando's commitment ran. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Brando was about to begin filming The Arrangement, a major production with millions of dollars already invested. He was the lead. The cameras were ready. And Brando said no. He walked away from the film entirely, announcing publicly that he was stepping back from acting to devote himself to the civil rights movement. The vacuum left by King's death, he said, had to be filled with concern and love, or everyone would be lost. He gave money to the Black Panthers, when doing so guaranteed FBI surveillance and public condemnation. He counted Bobby Seale as a close friend. He attended the memorial for George Jackson, the slain prison activist. Southern theater chains boycotted his films. Hollywood studios essentially blacklisted him, shutting him out of major roles because he was considered too difficult, too unpredictable, too willing to put his principles ahead of profit. But Brando didn't just write checks or make speeches. He showed up. In 1963, he testified before the California State Assembly in support of fair housing legislation. He joined picket lines himself, standing alongside protesters in demonstrations against housing discrimination. In 1964, he called for a boycott of his own films in South Africa, refusing to let them be shown to segregated audiences. In 1975, he protested American investments in apartheid South Africa and demanded Nelson Mandela's release, years before the rest of the world caught up to that cause. Brando approached activism the same way he approached acting, with total immersion. After King's death, he spent time in black communities, not as a celebrity visiting for a photo opportunity, but genuinely trying to understand the experience and the anger he was witnessing. He wanted to know what it felt like, not intellectually, but in his bones. The FBI kept extensive files on him. His career was nearly destroyed more than once. After the Oscar rejection in 1973, bullets were fired into his home while Little Feather was visiting. Both were terrorized. The media attacked him relentlessly. He never backed down. Years later, when Carson asked him about risking everything, Brando's answer cut through every excuse anyone had ever made for staying silent. Acting, he said, is not an important vocation in life when the world is still facing so many problems. His mother had taught him to stand up for people who were being marginalized. He never stopped honoring that lesson. Brando died in 2004 at 80. His Oscar refusal remains one of entertainment's most powerful protests ever staged, a moment that proved the greatest artists don't just perform on screen. They live their convictions off it. 9 stars, 9 different paths to the same impossible conclusion. Silence, when you have power, is not neutrality. It is complicity. These people understood that. They didn't all march. They didn't all make headlines, but every single one of them used what they had, their fame, their money, their platform, as a weapon against a system that was designed to crush anyone who didn't fit neatly inside it. They faced the FBI. They faced death threats. They faced boycotts and blacklisting and the slow, quiet erasure that Hollywood inflicts on anyone who becomes inconvenient. And not one of them backed down. That is what courage actually looks like. Not the absence of fear, not the absence of risk, but the decision made over and over again that some things are bigger than your career, bigger than your comfort, bigger than your safety. These 9 people proved it, and history remembers them for it.